All right, on to chapter 5.2. This is about carbohydrates. As we're going through these different macromolecules, I want you to think about a couple different things. One is, for each one, with the exception of lipids, what are the monomers of each one, and what are the polymers? And as you're looking at them, each monomer and each is the polymers, I want you to think about what are the structures and what are the functions. So what are the structures of the monomers and functions, and and then for the polymers, what are the structures and functions? We will get to lipids eventually, and then really you're just interested in structure and function, and you don't have to really worry about monomers and polymers. So the monomers of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides, and the polymers are called polysaccharides. Sometimes we use the term sugar interchangeably for monosaccharides, and that's all right. But there are some sugars that technically are actually like a disaccharide, which is a little bit more than a monosaccharide. So you'll see this in a minute. So monosaccharides, they have this molecular formula of CH2O. So glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. So it'd be C6, and then it's H12. So with CH2O, the hydrogens are twice as many as the carbons, and the hydrogens are also going to be twice as many as the oxygens. And you can see that's the case here. So there's C6, which is the same as O6, right? They're the same, and then they're both. The hydrogens are twice as much as the carbons and or the oxygens. And we can classify our monosaccharides by a number of different ways. I'm just going to show you the pictures. It's a lot easier. So here, kind of if you're looking, they can be an aldose. So if you look on the carbon chain, basically there's an aldehyde. It's an aldehyde, but it's a carbonyl group, and you can see it in both here, the C double bonded to O. And then each carbon has a hydroxyl group. All right. So if the carbon doesn't have the carbonyl group, it has an OH. So if that carbonyl group is on the end, it's an aldehyde. So it can be an aldose, or if that carbonyl group is in the middle, we call it a ketose because it's a ketone. So here, we've got our trioses. Ose really refers to carbohydrates. If you see that suffix, it's carbohydrate. But I feel like it's almost like mainly reserved for our simple sugars, but it's not. You will see it in some polysaccharides. But if it's an aldehyde, it's an aldose. Ketone is a ketose. So if you're looking at this, you've got 3 carbons. So we've got our carbonyl group and then 2 hydroxyl groups. All right, and that's glyceraldehyde. Ketone, same thing. We have our carbonyl group and then 2 hydroxyl groups. And then we fill in the rest with hydrogens. Going on to our pentose, which is a 5-carbon sugar, we're really just looking at the differences between, aldoses and ketoses. Although we could get some different varieties, but that's kind of what we have now. Ribose, you've heard of with like deoxyribose or deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. It contains this sugar. Ribulose, you may not have heard of. It's in photosynthesis. It's a fairly big player in that. And then here's our hexoses, and as the slide before said, that it's mainly, the big one is glucose. You've heard of that, I would imagine, with blood glucose, blood sugar levels, and so on. So on the left, we have our aldehydes or our aldoses. On the right, we have our ketone. And then you can see, you can get some variety where our hydroxyl group might flip-flop the side in which it's found, and that can actually create different types of sugars, even though they all have the same molecular formula. But this can create variety, and so you got glucose and galactose and then fructose, which I guarantee you've heard of if you read food labels in the past 10 years or more, with high fructose corn syrup, which is relatively cheap to make. So all those kind of drawings are what we call like linear or straight chain the forms, but those don't really exist when you have water present. So you throw these into water and they curl up into some sort of shape. So if it's a 6-carbon sugar, it'll curl up into a hexagon, and sometimes a pentagon, depending. Most of your 5-carbon sugars will curl up into a pentagon sort of shape, but it still retains the same formula. And before we go on to our polymers, I'll just say that the main function of monosaccharides is to store energy. All right, so glucose, we're storing it like chemical energy in the bonds. Fructose, same thing. Ribose is probably more of a structural sugar, because it's used in like an RNA and DNA, but overwhelmingly, like the whole purpose of these monosaccharides are for energy storage. So I can show you what if you take two different monosaccharides and link them together, we make a disaccharide. So here, remember we talked about dehydration or condensation syntheses. If you take two glucoses, it's kind of awkward to say, right? And we bind them together. You can make one thing is maltose, and you can see where we take the OH and an H, and we make H2O, and this it's really two bonds in between. It's called a glycosidic linkage. Although this oxygen probably originally belonged to the sugar on the right, but kind of the way it's formed up, it's almost like two bonds are linking them together. And then if you go on the bottom, we're making table sugar. We're taking glucose, combining it with fructose to make sucrose. Same process of kind of piecing together these monosaccharides. And these kind of these are sugary, but they're not really monosaccharides, they're disaccharides. But they're not like polymers, these big long polymers. All right, on to polysaccharides. We're going to have a little bit maybe more variety in function, but not a whole lot more. So polysaccharides can be this really, really super long chain of monosaccharides. So we're first one is starch. You probably heard of that one. The technical name is at the bottom. It's called amylose. But you've heard of starchy foods and so on, and that's what the plants will do to store energy, right? They'll create glucose, and then they'll send it a lot of them will send it to their roots and let it kind of sit in their roots and kind of combine as starch that they can use later on, to grow. So here you can kind of see all of the kind of the chain is all chained up here, and each one of these hexagons is a glucose. All right, and like I said, it's you piece it together, you make some starch, and the technical term is amylose. And that's a real simple one. If you add some more like chains on there, we get something called amylopectin. If people make jelly, you might have heard of pectin. I'm not really sure how that all fits in together, but remember, this is energy storage here. And here's just like an electron micrograph of showing kind of these like membranous structures that have starch in them in a cell. Now, it would be really inefficient, I think, for us if we just had glucose and glucose only. So we kind of have like our own starch, and it's called glycogen. We store it in our liver. We store it in our muscles, in your muscles if it needs to break off some some monos or some glucose to kind of run the muscle. It's got it stored in glycogen, and it's got a lot more branches than that amylopectin. But there it is, and then like in this picture, you can kind of see how it's all kind of stored up there. Now, here's a different story. This is cellulose. Cellulose is not for energy storage. Cellulose is actually a structural sort of thing that the plants will use, to make cell walls. It's in paper. It's in wood. So it's really, or actually it is. I should say it is paper. It is wood. It's the cell walls of a plant, and it's really hardy. So you can see kind of the different levels of structure where like all these cellulose are kind of stuck together, and then they're put together in like different fibers. And like I said, it's really hardy. And that's how the plant gets its own structure. You can see the electron micrograph. So we went over this. Is basically like our glycogens in the liver and the muscles, cellulose in plant cell walls, and I'm going to make another video just about the difference between, say, cellulose and starch, but I don't want to make this too long. So sorry, So I want to go over chitin, which is another structural polysaccharides. It's actually what we call an amino sugar. So chitin is found in the exoskeleton of arthropods, and it's found in the cell walls of fungus. So here you can see this looks like a dragonfly of some sort. If you've been walking around lately, you might have seen some exoskeletons of cicadas stuck to a wall, or they seem to like land on our grill cover and kind of pull themselves out of their exoskeleton. So that part that they're leaving is chitin, and when the arthropod gets too big for its skeleton, it sheds it and it secretes a new one, and it's secreting chitin here. You can see it's an amino sugar, so the amine is right here, and here's the sugar part. So that's what it's going to secrete, and that's what it left behind.